there's no going back. You've changed things.
So what's your podcast about?
Oh, it's about psychology, true crime, supernatural stuff, the occasional paranormal or philosophical rant.
Well, maybe I could check it out sometime.
Let me say that we have been highly effective in conditioning the people's minds to accept our solution to the world's problems.
One of the things that I learned from the Cabal itself is that they have to work within something they call the rules.
Our society is run by insane people for insane objectives.
Do I have your attention now?
Oswald, Ruby, Cuba, the mafia. Keeps them guessing like some kind of parlor game, prevents them from asking the most important question, why? Why was Kennedy killed? Who benefited? Who has the power to cover it up?
You know, but I'm liable to be put away as insane for expressing that.
To them, you're just a freak. They need you right now. When they're done, they'll cast you out.
The public has lost total confidence in any form of government.
All of that ended on the 22nd of November, 1963.
See, I'm not a monster. I'm just ahead of the curve.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural.
The official story is often the simple one. A lone gunman, a mail-order rifle, a 6th-floor window. 3 shots that changed history forever. But history has a peculiar way of resisting simplicity, especially when blood stains the pages. Lee Harvey Oswald remains one of America's most haunting specters, not merely because he was accused of assassinating President John F. Kennedy, but because his life feels less like a straightforward biography and more like a fractured psychological dossier assembled from Cold War paranoia, ideological confusion, and unanswered questions. He was a former Marine, defector to the Soviet Union, Marxist sympathizer, drifter, husband, alleged killer, murder victim himself. Oswald was a man whose identity seemed to shift like smoke, depending on who was observing him. And perhaps that is where the true shadow begins, not simply in whether Oswald acted alone, but in what kind of man becomes the axis upon which an entire era's trust collapses. This is where true crime intersects with myth. Oswald was not just a suspect. He became an archetype, the disillusioned outsider, maybe the politically charged misfit, or the man whose personal instability collided with machinery of global power. Whatever it was, his story unfolds at the height of the Cold War, when America's fear of communism, espionage, and internal subversion was reaching a fever pitch. In such an environment, Oswald was either the perfect lone scapegoat or the perfect operative for forces far larger than himself. And maybe the forbidden question is, could Oswald be the assassin? Or was he simply another pawn in the deep architecture of deception? The unsettling reality is that Oswald's life is filled with contradictions that continue to invite scrutiny. His Soviet defection should have marked him permanently, yet he returns to America with surprising ease. His public pro-Castro activism was conspicuous, almost theatrical. His movements in the months before Dallas remain a labyrinth of intelligence whispers, anti-Castro tensions, and fragmented testimonies. Then before he could fully speak for himself, Jack Ruby silenced him on live television. He was a nightclub owner with alleged mob ties stepping directly into history's bloodstream. That moment transformed a murder investigation into an American ghost story. For true crime, Oswald offers more than a case file. He offers the autonomy of uncertainty. He is a study in fractured identity, possible manipulation, and the terrifying possibility modern history may pivot not simply on facts, but on narratives constructed quickly enough to stabilize a shaken nation. And perhaps that is why Oswald endures in the cultural imagination. Because beyond the rifle, beyond Dealey Plaza, beyond conspiracy or coincidence lies something darker. The fear that truth itself may have been one of the casualties in Dallas. Lee Harvey Oswald was either a lone gunman or the face placed upon forces we still struggle to comprehend. In the shadows of November 22nd, 1963, the question is not merely who fired the shots. The question is whether we were ever meant to know. There are few moments in American history that leave more impact and shockwaves than the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And 60 years later, the dust of that story hasn't settled. Every time you think the story is finally understood, another detail bends the light, another witness contradicts the story, and another document slips out of a classified vault with just enough truth that makes the whole thing wobble. Most people will look at this mess and shrug, it's too complicated, there's too much debate, just let it go. But some minds aren't wired to look away. Some people decide to follow the discrepancies all the way down, no matter how long it takes or how tangled the path becomes. They map the angles, test the geometry, dissect the testimony, and track the clues everyone else seems to miss. Today, that kind of investigator joins us. He spent years doing the work most people would rather pretend doesn't need doing, pulling apart one of the most controversial cases in modern history and rebuilding it from the evidence forward. Cory Hughes, welcome to Truth and Shadow Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, and please feel free to leave any kind of websites, links, and then go ahead and tell us about yourself and what you've been doing.
Sure. Best place for all my stuff is coryhughes.org. And so I've been a full-time Kennedy researcher since July 2018. It is still, after all these years, the one thing that gets me out of bed every morning, and it's the last thing I think about every night before I fall asleep. There is so much more to the story than anybody has ever been told. And there's even more when you dig into the life of Lee Harvey Oswald, which is absolutely not what we have been told. So I spend my time mostly these days working on my new book, which will be my third book, Lee Harvey Oswald in Black and White, Volume 2. It'll be the second of a minimum 4-book series on the life of Oswald, because Oswald's life is pretty readily broken up into segments. You have Oswald's life until he joins the Marines in October 56. Then you have his time in the Marines. Then you have his time in the Soviet Union. And then you have from June 62 until the end. Those are the basic 4 segments of Oswald's life. So, yeah, and the next one will be out. I've already started it. I'm about 50 pages into it. So it should be out early next year, January or February.
Fantastic. What was it about Lee Harvey Oswald that was your triggering or your focus? What was it in that story?
It's kind of funny, because when you really come to understand the Kennedy assassination and the major players, you come to find that Oswald's nowhere to be found. Oswald is a man who, the story tells us, he was actively involved with these criminals down in New Orleans and hanging out with a bunch of people he shouldn't have been. And I found none of that is true at all. And so Oswald as a character in a story, being he's the antagonist of the story. It's kind of hilarious, because the more I came to learn about the Kennedy assassination, the more I realized I didn't know nothing about Oswald because he's not involved in anything, right? And so, despite the fact he's the main character in the story, the vast majority of things you know about Oswald are false and were planted aspects of what's called a legend. A legend is a false background that spies usually use to take on new endeavors, right? And so the thing about Lee Harvey Oswald is that once you realize that there's all this hullabaloo over Oswald and he really had nothing to do with nothing, it's like you start to look into Oswald and you're like, well, what is Oswald's story? And then when you start to look into the life of Lee Harvey Oswald, you come to find the most absolutely and genuinely unbelievable set of circumstances that follows him his entire life from the time he's 2 years old all the way until the end. And so in particular, what you'll find is that the historical record of Oswald, when you actually put together all the pieces on it, instead of laying out a single timeline of Oswald's life, what you end up with are two parallel timelines, because Oswald is continually in two places at once, really from 1941 all the way throughout the Marines. And I haven't gotten to my Soviet studies yet, but there's some indication that there's some major shenanigans going on in the Soviet Union involving two Oswalds also. And so ultimately, many, many years ago, a man named John Armstrong wrote a book called Harvey and Lee, which is about Oswald. And he basically exposed the fact that Oswald was probably part of some naval intelligence operation going back to the time he was a child. And when you dig into the life of his relatives, you find they're all spooks, right? You'll never find any documents that say they're spooks, but their behavior and their being in multiple places at once and all this, there's a whole lot of more factors, but you come to understand Oswald's whole family was involved in some form of intelligence. And I believe that's how he got involved. And so that is where the story for me and Oswald kind of begins. And so from there, it becomes a very complicated tale of spycraft and, CIA wizardry. But ultimately, it is a crazy story, and Oswald had nothing to do with the assassination, and his life story will lead you to a whole world, an underworld of intelligence and weird things that really are beyond explanation.
Yeah, there seems to be something that's kind of niggling at my head right now is I've done a little bit of looking at the MK Ultra project and some of the stuff that happened before that. And I wonder if his parents were spooks, or his family, at least some people in his family were, what are the odds that this, Lee Harvey was raised to basically be a product of that endeavor, if you will?
Right. So one of the conclusions I've made is that there are intelligence families. Ruth Payne, who's involved in the assassination, she gave a place for Oswald and his wife to live. Her whole family is a bunch of spooks. Her dad was basically a CIA cutout. And when you dig into all the relevant people, they're all CIA connected, And so Oswald, his life, it appears as though he was dragged along. Willing participant in an intelligence operation to get a spy into the Soviet Union before there was a CIA is kind of how I look at it. And so he was definitely dragged along through that. His whole life, he seems like an unwilling participant in life itself. And so when he gets into the Marines, this pattern of Oswald being in two places at once continues the whole time he's in the Marines. I can put Oswald in in 57 and 58, I can put him in three places at once with witnesses on every side. You know what I mean? So, but Oswald was definitely seemingly he was a willing participant in this long-term intelligence scheme. But when you really come to get a grip on his personality and his character, it was begrudgingly, you know what I mean? I feel like Oswald never felt that he was a free person to do just what he wanted to do. And if you follow his life, it appears that that's the case. Everything he did, even just working the different jobs that he had in Texas and in New Orleans, when he got back from the Soviet Union, appear to be like front jobs or they were either front jobs where he was off doing other things, or they were jobs that were just keeping him busy, because you don't really, if you have a guy who's going to be set up to be a patsy in an assassination, are you going to have him out there actively running operations? I don't think so. I think you're going to have him on hold. And I think that's Oswald's life post when he gets back from the Soviet Union. He's forced to get these BS jobs. Then he goes on unemployment. So I'm kind of torn over whether they were just keeping him in a holding pattern until the assassination, because the setup started at minimum March of 63, probably sooner. But I'm kind of torn over whether he was out doing other intelligence activities, or if they were just having him sit around and do nothing and waiting for the assassination, because that's what they had him do in Russia. He goes to Russia and he's not some super spy over there. He just went over there and did nothing. Literally, he got a job at a factory and went home every day, and they listened to him doing nothing. And I think that's a big part of why they sent false defectors to the Soviet Union in the first place. Because if they send a dozen guys over there, that's at least a dozen teams that these Russians are going to have to set up to monitor these people to make sure they're not spies, right? So they get all these Russians spinning their gears for a bunch of guys who are doing nothing. I think that was kind of how the system worked of false defection, because none of those guys went there and did any active spying stuff. There were a bunch of operations with the intent of doing that. Like AE Balcony was one that went from 59 to 62, the same years that Oswald was in the Soviet Union. But that was more of recruiting students to recruit other people, right? We don't have any indication that ever worked. And actually, we know that some of the people who were sent over on the AE Balcony program got disappeared once they got to the Soviet Union. And they actually said in the AE Balcony documents, they were only actually able to extract one person they had sent over there under that program. So how many of our guys got scooped up by the Russians? You know what I mean? But Oswald gets there, and the guy is really, he talks a good game, and he talks about communism, and he talks about all this stuff, but they can tell right from the jump, this doesn't feel right. And in the new Russian document that was released, that we got from the Russians recently, it has a sentence in there that describes that when Oswald got to town, he didn't make any attempts to explore the country, to engage in any cultural activities. He didn't try to check it out in any way, shape, or form. He gets there and instantly goes to the embassy to try to do a false defection. And so it was obvious to them what he was, you know. And so now when we get like the Russian documents from them about it's only 300 pages on Oswald and what he was doing and stuff, but none of it's about what he was doing. It's really all about the interactions between the Soviets and us around the Kennedy assassination, with maybe 20, 30 pages on Oswald thrown in there. But they knew right from the jump what he was. You know what I mean? And then after the assassination happens, they knew also that it was a setup of Oswald, because he had sent a couple letters to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. from Texas. And so they get these letters, and so they have an established, of course, they analyze these letters, right, for all kinds of stuff, right, speech patterns and whatever. And so they already had like 3 letters, I think, from Oswald. Then they get another letter on the 9th of November, allegedly from Oswald, where he's talking about it's totally different shift in tone. And he's talking to them like they're friends. He's talking to the Soviet embassy in this letter like they're buddy. And he even says at one time in the letter, I had to get out of Mexico because if I was going to stay any longer, I would have had to use my real name. Well, Lee Harvey Oswald is his real name, right? So there is no fake Russian name that they were alluding to in that letter. So the letter was a provocation. And so the Russians called that out immediately. They knew it was a fake. They knew it was a provocation. And they knew that it was a part of the setup of Oswald. And so the Russians knew it was a conspiracy from the jump, right? Just based on the information they had on Oswald alone. And so that's the most fascinating new revelations that we have in the Kennedy case coming from this Russian document, which is, in my opinion, more of an olive branch from the modern Russian government to our government, saying, hey, we don't have to repeat the mistakes of yesterday. When you read through the contents, he's talking about Kennedy wanting to like bridge the gap between the Soviet Union and us, and all this stuff that Kennedy was trying to do. And so when you really read this new Russian document, it's really a, hey, let's all get along, and there's no reason for us to repeat the mistakes of yesterday. Sorry, my dogs are howling.
It's okay. It's okay. Were these letters, I mean, Cory, the bad thing is sometimes we have to speculate on so much stuff, but if we look at those letters that you're talking about, do we know if they were written by Lee Harvey Oswald or they weren't?
So I need to go back and pull the original letters that were sent before November 9th. There should be 3 of them. My suspicion is that they were not written by Oswald, or if they were, it was simply dictated to him. The 4th letter on November 9th, which it actually has Lee Harvey Oswald's apparent real signature on it, but the rest of the letter is typed, whereas the rest of the letters were all handwritten. So I can give you 50 different ways you can get someone's signature at the bottom of a page, and then have them fill in whatever else they're going to write in there. So that's what I believe happened with that letter. His signature's on it, which is either a forgery or a good forgery, or they had his name on the bottom of a piece of paper and they filled in the rest.
Right, right. They just typed the letter up on top of the...
Right, but the thing that's important about this whole thing is that the Russians made it very clear they knew that letter was a provocation. And in saying that, they knew the modern day research community would be all over this. And that, to me, was the Russians being like, look, we know it was a conspiracy, period, right? And the Russians, I have a feeling, know everything. Like, they might not know the details on the ground, but I'm telling you, like, if you don't think Putin knows exactly what happened on 9/11, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's their job when something like this happens. They got to get to the bottom of it because they need to know so they understand the greater geopolitical implications, right? And so I have no doubts the Russians know everything that happens about everything. So...
Yeah, fair enough. So if, like, we're looking at Lee Harvey Oswald, where was he brought up and raised?
Well, he was born in New Orleans, October 18th, 1939. And so this is where we start to run into problems with Oswald's life because we have a well-documented history going up till April of 44 with him being in New Orleans. By April of 44, he is then moved to Dallas, Texas, where he lives at an address on Victor Street. The issue is that when we get into some of Oswald's own handwritten documents, we have some major contradictions in where he says he was in his own handwriting and where we know he was as per the actual record. And so the first indication that there's a split in the record is he writes that he was in Fort Worth from 41 all the way to 56. That is absolutely blatantly false. So why did he write that on his history? Because it probably is true. But the thing that most people will always have a hard time dealing with is that there were genuinely 2 Lee Harvey Oswalds who were both brothers who were part of this intelligence operation going back to at least 1941. So when you try to explain this to people, they instantly tune out. They're like, oh, whatever, you're crazy. Well, there is a very common intelligence tactic called identity transfer. And identity transfer is where you have an identity donor who then willingly donates his identity to a spy, and then that spy uses that identity as a cover, right? That's a legend. And that's exactly, I believe, what they did with Oswald going back to the time he was a child. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the sheer amount of contradictions that we have in the record. And I can think off the top of my head, probably 20 right off the top of my head, just in his early life alone on where he's supposed to be living and where he's actually living, So.
Let's pull on that thread for a second there with the legend, the 2 Lee Harvey Oswalds, what's one doing while the other one's doing? I mean, who is the real Lee Harvey and which one is like the legend? I mean,
one thing that was determined by a researcher named John Armstrong, who was like the progenitor of the Harvey and Lee theory. And honestly, after studying his work in depth and writing a book on it, I can tell you it's not just theory, it's absolute reality. So we have at times, I'll give you a great example, okay? I have in my book at least 6 times that Oswald in his early life introduced himself as 2 people who knew him as the name Harvey Oswald, okay? This starts to appear really in 1951. We have this name Harvey Oswald on a consolidated census record from Texas. So we have a legal document shows the name Harvey Oswald, not Lee Harvey Oswald. Then we get into like the 1954 to 1956 era. So Oswald will go to New York, and there's a whole slew of contradictions there, okay? When he's in New York, he sees a therapist named Milton Kurian. He will introduce himself to Milton Kurian as Harvey Oswald. So when Milton Kurian is interviewed, he keeps referring to him as Harvey Oswald. fast forward to January 1954, Lee Harvey Oswald, the real Lee Harvey Oswald, I can't find where he's living between January and May of 1954. But I can tell you that during this time at Beauregard Junior High School in New Orleans, there is a boy attending it would be the 8th grade, and he meets a teacher there named Myra DeRusse LaRue, who they kind of become friends. He's hanging out after school at the library all the time, and she was like teaching girls physical education and sports. So she kind of met him after school because he was always hanging out because he never wanted to go home. And so he introduced himself to Myra DeRusse LaRue as Harvey Oswald. She always knew him as Harvey. Okay. So I have in my book 6 different incidents where he either introduces himself as Harvey or writes his name in a phone book as Harvey or is known to people just in general by Harvey. This behavior, actually, this pattern of use of the name Harvey Oswald will actually reappear once he gets back from the Soviet Union. Okay. So let me just cut to the chase. The real Lee Harvey Oswald is photographed on his passport September 10th, 1959 in Los Angeles. Okay. The real Lee Harvey Oswald. And I have a picture, actually, I can bring up and show you the differences. So this is the last time we ever see the real Lee Harvey Oswald. The person who went to the Soviet Union and came back, who was involved in everything with Kennedy, is the boy who introduced himself as Harvey Oswald to Milton Kurian and to Myra DeRusse LaRue and a half a dozen other people who knew this person as Harvey. So when you first hear this concept that there's 2 Lee Harvey Oswalds, you're like, this is insane. You're crazy. Even I, to this day, still feel crazy talking about it at times because it's so outside the box. But when you actually go through the records, it's indisputable. So this period of 1954 to 1956, in my opinion, is some of the most crucial evidence for this 2 Oswald scheme, because we don't have an address for Lee Harvey Oswald till May of 54. He will move into 1454 St. Mary in New Orleans in late May. We have multiple people testify this to the Warren Commission, okay, that he moved in there in late May. Yet we have somebody going by Harvey Oswald attending Beauregard the whole first semester of that 54 school year, right? And so we don't see the real Lee Harvey Oswald until May of 1954 when he moves into that St. Mary address. Then we have some major contradictions in the record because they're supposed to be living at 1454 St. Mary until June of 1955. Okay, this sounds like I'm nitpicking on addresses, but it's so important because during this time of basically May 54 until June of 55, that's when Oswald's supposed to be at 1454 St. Mary. However, we have letters from Marguerite Oswald to her other son, John Pick, who lives up in New York, starting in October of 54 at an address 126 Exchange Place. Okay. The thing that's important about this is that Oswald and his mother aren't supposed to live at 126 Exchange Place until June of 55. But Myra DeRusse LaRue, who knew Oswald at Beauregard in January through about that first semester, as she knew Harvey Oswald, she drove him home to 126 Exchange Place sometime around March of 1954, which is well over a year and a couple months before they're ever supposed to have ever lived there. And we have people testifying on both ends of this. We have the testimony of Myra DeRusse LaRue. We have the testimony of Lillian Moret, who is Oswald's aunt, who is clearly in on this scheme and covering for her sister. And so it really gets out of control. And then I actually traced when Oswald's supposed to be at Beauregard Junior High until June of 55. I was actually able to put him at 2 different schools in Fort Worth in late 54 and the whole first semester of 55, while we have full school records of him being in New Orleans that whole time, right? I've got at least a half a dozen witnesses who put him in Fort Worth for that late 54 through mid 55 school year. And the funny thing is about this is that the house that he's living at during this time while he's in Fort Worth is an address 7313 Davenport. Okay. This doesn't appear anywhere in the record anywhere. You'll never find this in any Kennedy record except the work of John Armstrong. Well, it turns out that Robert Oswald will end up moving into that house, and it's known that Robert Oswald lived there. It's in all the records, but that doesn't happen for 2 more years. So here we have Lee Harvey Oswald living at an address on Davenport in Fort Worth, where his brother will move into 2 years later. This is crazy. This is insane. Why is Oswald at an address we already know about 2 years before we're supposed to know about it, right? It sounds like I'm nitpicking little stuff, but this little stuff is like you pull these threads and the whole story of Oswald's life comes crumbling to the ground. So, yeah, this is what gets me out of bed every day. Like, this to me is so exciting because it's uncharted territory. And when I got into Kennedy, I was like, there's no uncharted territory left. Oh my God, there is so much uncharted territory. So much.
The information is like really important to kind of have written down, but I'm just want to draw the picture here. So were you saying basically at the same time in Fort Worth, we have a Harvey Oswald and one in New Orleans?
You have the real Lee Oswald in New Orleans in the January to June 1955 school year, which is just a crazy thing. You have Harvey Oswald going to school for that first January semester, right? He leaves. And then the real Lee Harvey Oswald comes and takes his place at that school. So the school records are one continuous school record from January 54 all the way to June 55, which completely conflicts with all of the witness testimony of, you have at least two people who put him in Fort Worth. You have the vice principal of Stripling Junior High who had Oswald's records and turned him over to the FBI. He provided a statement to John Armstrong. I mean, a vice principal providing records to the FBI, telling a Kennedy researcher, that's about as great of a reference as you can possibly get. So we know with absolute certainty Oswald was at Stripling for at least 6 weeks in that 54 to 55 school year. And then after that 6-week period, that's when we start to have the witnesses like Randall Reeves and Tommy Brown and a couple other guys who knew Oswald at what was called Monig Junior High. And I actually have the picture. They're like, yeah, this is Oswald in the photograph of the school, right? At the school, the 1955 graduating class. I've got that picture. And there's a guy in it who looks like Oswald. I'm like, what is going on here, right? So the evidence of Oswald being in two places at once, especially in this January to June 55, to me is irrefutable. And the funny thing is, it never changes, right? The irrefutability of Oswald being in two places at once does never change. After that, after 55 to 56 is when things get really serious, because the whole entire time that when you look at the official record of Oswald's life and where he lived, it's all the real Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother, their real addresses that whole time. However, that changes in 56. In 56, the addresses of the official record become the address of Harvey and his mother. 54, 55 school year, where you have Harvey there in the January semester and he leaves over summer break. And then after summer break, Lee comes in and takes his place. So they're close enough in looks to where I can see how over a summer break, a kid would appear to grow 5-6 inches. You know what I mean? I think that's how they pulled it off. I think that is the only time they could have pulled it off in that manner.
Yeah, that would make sense. It wouldn't be like a winter break. It would have to be something like a summer vacation.
Right,
the
exactly.
Amount of time difference is months that way. There's growth. I mean, obviously, you talk to people, they shoot up 6 inches a foot in the summer.
Yeah.
So it's possible.
Right.
Okay.
And I think that's how they got away with it that year, because that is the only time they switched them out at the same school.
And so I'm going to assume that the switching out was done by spooks, basically, is basically what I'm understanding.
So I'm still trying to figure out the relationship between how the spooks handled Marguerite and Lee. It's kind of tough to figure out. Obviously, they had some kind of handler going on somewhere. Okay. Had to. And so fellow researcher Diana Thomas discovered that every address attributed to Marguerite and Lee in very close proximity was either an orphanage or a lunatic asylum. And both of those, and they were Lutheran. And Marguerite and her son were allegedly Lutheran, but they never went to church. So I don't know what that's about. So the top two pictures are of the real Lee Harvey Oswald. The photograph on the top left, that's Lee Oswald photographed September 10th, 1959, when he got his passport. The picture on the right was also taken in 1959, taken by his brother. And that photograph actually appears in Robert Oswald's book, Lee, which came out in 1967. Those two people are obviously the same person, if you ask me. Look at the two pictures at the bottom. This is the person that we know as Lee Harvey Oswald. That is not even close to the same person. The big differences are in the chin. If you look at the top pictures, the real Lee Oswald had a very kind of pointed chin that came to like a very narrow kind of point. Whereas the Oswald who got arrested, he had a very wide chin. I mean, it's obvious here in these pictures, you know? So usually these pictures are the icing on the cake for most people, but it's a very twisted tale. But once you come to understand that our intelligence communities do covert operations and they have something called identity transfer, which is exactly what we're talking about, then the whole story really falls into place. And if you think about it, this is way before. This started back in my opinion, 41. A whole lot of stuff happened in 41, particularly with Marguerite Oswald. And so 41 is way before there was a CIA or even an OSS. Well, technically the OSS started in 42. In 41, you have the Office of the Coordinator of Information, which is the first ever civilian intelligence that America ever had. So they're not involved with this. So who the hell is running covert ops prior to that? There's only one group. It's Naval Intelligence. ONI are the big guns in covert ops prior to the CIA. So this to me is a naval intelligence pre-Cold War plot to get a spy into the Soviet Union. Period. At some point in time, it had to get handed over to the CIA because they took over all central intelligence. They took over all any intelligence operations that were going on that were of like this kind of nature. They obviously took over. And so that to me makes it pretty clear Oswald was naval intelligence. Because what do they say? Once ONI, always ONI, right? And so I have no doubts that he was operating under the auspices of naval intelligence. And then once he gets back from the Soviet Union, the CIA is actively setting him up. So something happens there. He was turned on. Why was he turned on? And I don't know. Maybe because he brought a Russian spy back with him. You know, that to me seems like, hey, the Russians weren't stupid. They knew that he was a spy. So when you read the Russians' explanation on why they let them leave, it doesn't make any sense because they don't let Russian citizens leave, period. And the excuse for letting her leave was that she didn't have any intelligence knowledge. So why not let her leave? I'm like, well, nobody in the damn country had intelligence knowledge, so why not let all of them leave, right? So their explanation is stupid. I believe they knew he was a spook, and so they sent a spook back with him because her whole backstory, just the very little bit that I've started to dig into, it kind of contradicts, and her name changes, and so it's like all kinds of weird stuff. And honestly, when I look at some of the pictures of her, they don't look like some of the other pictures of her. So I don't know what the hell's going on with Marina, but when she gets back to the States, she is 100% clearly involved with a guy named Kerry Thornley, who is actively setting Oswald up. She actively participated in the setup of Oswald. So there's a point where Oswald is back he goes to Mexico City, allegedly, but he never really went. And so after leaving there's a whole bunch of sightings of Oswald in Alice, Texas. And he tries to get a job at a radio station. And when he goes in and talks to them, he had a beat up old car and a woman with a baby in the back seat. We're out in the car. And he's like, yeah, my wife doesn't speak English, so I just let her sit out there. That was Kerry Thornley setting Oswald up. It was never Oswald. Oswald never went to Mexico City. I can prove Oswald never went to Mexico City. Oswald was still in New Orleans on September 26th of 63 when he's supposed to be in Mexico City, right? So I can prove he's not where they say he is. And so another problem that I have explaining Kennedy to people is that the early life Oswald stuff, the impersonation of Oswald, I believe it was two brothers who were part of a naval intelligence operation. That is completely different from the Oswald impersonations that begin in 1961. Because in 1961, Oswald is impersonated for the very first time at Bolton Ford in New Orleans. And he goes there with a husky Latin with a pockmarked face, a guy I've identified as a guy named Lawrence Howard. And so this person who went and gave the name of Oswald, he actually gave the name Lee Oswald on a written price quote sheet. This is in January of 61. Oswald doesn't get back from the Soviet Union until June of 62, right? So we have someone here impersonating Oswald, but this has nothing to do at all with the Dual Oswald scheme, which I believe was in place until he defects to the Soviet Union. So we have the termination of one operation in 59. And then once he's over there in the Soviet Union, they start to set him up. So they start setting him up. Well, see, I don't know that there was no plot to kill the president back then. So they couldn't have been setting him up to kill the president in 61. So what the hell were they doing dropping his name. What were they setting him up to do? Why were they using the name in 61 long before there ever could have been an assassination plot? That I don't have an answer to, and I would very much like one. I think I have some feeling towards it because one of the guys who Oswald went through the Marines with, well, for at least 3 months in Santa Ana, California, was a guy named Cory Thornley. Cory Thornley, I've determined, was a guy who got recruited by the CIA back in high school. And then he goes into the Marines between his junior and senior year. And then when he gets to he's interviewed at the Warren Commission, he lies about his entire Marine background. And so this guy basically goes to New Orleans after he gets out of the Marines and starts hanging out with David Ferry and Clay Shaw and the whole crew in New Orleans involved in the assassination. And then Oswald gets back June of 62, but according to Cory Thornley, he didn't know Oswald was back and he never saw Oswald, which totally is contradicted by numerous statements of people who knew the two of them, who saw them together at the Bourbon House and a couple other places, right? So Cory Thornley, a big liar, definitely CIA, definitely paired with the CIA guys in New Orleans virtually immediately after getting out of the Marines. And so Cory Thornley is the guy who's in Mexico City. Cory Thornley is hanging out with Marina, setting Oswald up in different places. There's a whole bunch of sightings of Oswald with a pregnant woman, with another child, doing different things, right? At Furniture Mart in Dallas, there's an incident, and there's about half a dozen of these incidents where Oswald is seen with his pregnant wife. Well, at times when I can tell you with certainty Oswald is nowhere known. I don't know where the hell Oswald is. Definitely not Oswald's, right? So he's getting impersonated by Cory Thornley. And so Cory Thornley ends up being one of the major players in the assassination itself and the killing of J.D. Tippit, and ultimately the cover-up afterwards. So I forget where I was going with that. But Cory Thornley, definitely one of the most ignored people in the entire Kennedy story. And it's important because he was, I believe, paired with Oswald, or at least he was sent to Oswald's old duty roster assignments at Sugi. And so wherever Oswald went, Cory Thornley was sent just behind him. You know what I mean? Like the same classes, but almost like they wanted him to know what Oswald was studying and doing. And like, I feel like they told him to become Oswald, basically, because he ends up impersonating Oswald all kinds of places post June of 62, besides the early stuff at Bolton Ford, right? So, but it's really important because he knew Oswald all the way back then. And it goes to show that the intelligence guys had their eyes on Oswald long before the official story ever tells us that anyone ever caught wind of him. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so one of the things that just is weird, and this is kind of bugging me a little bit, not in a bad way, but what was these impersonations? Why was they trying to impersonate, say Harvey was here in Mexico City, or he was over here, over there?
I believe a lot of these incidents involved him saying things that could be used against Oswald later. Like a good example is in October of 63, at a time when Oswald is living in Fort Worth, allegedly, Lee Harvey Oswald, in quotes, and his Russian-speaking wife and their child go to meet with a woman named McGee in Baton Rouge, and they go look at a room that she was renting out. And so they go down, and it's definitely not Oswald, okay? It's definitely Cory Thornley and Marina setting Oswald up. He goes to this place and he starts asking her, hey, I got a gun collection. Is this place safe? I need to store my guns. Hey, I hear Kennedy's coming to town, right? Oh, do you know what communism is? I'm a Marxist, right? Like just basically telling this lady all this stuff that she never even asked. And she even said that to the FBI. He said all this stuff and I never even asked him about none of it. You know what I mean? So that was a pattern of things that they did before the assassination. You got 100+ people coming forward saying, hey, I dealt with this guy before the assassination and he talked about guns and communism and right. He said stuff that made himself stick out. You know what I mean? And so whenever you start reading these, you're like, this ain't Oswald. They're setting him up. And so, but that setup went on for the setup of Oswald went on for 2.5 years, which is crazy because I can't put the origin of the plot pre-63. The earliest I can really put the plot is like March of 63 because that's when they ordered the rifle in his name. He never ordered the rifle. The rifle was ordered with a fake money order. So the whole story we have about how he got the rifle is total BS. We don't really know. I mean, I know I've been able to track the rifle into the States in a group. It came in a box of 70 rifles, 70 Carcanos, and 3 of them made their way to New Orleans. One to David Ferry, one to Emilio Santana, and then Oswald allegedly got one of these that he ordered through the mail, which is the whole story is BS. So,
okay, so the goal was basically to
set him up in various ways
as a Marxist,
right?
But so geopolitically, I mean, this is the Cold War. So okay. So we're talking about Cold War era communists against Americans or whatever is going on.
Back then, if you were a communist, you were kind of like, like persona non grata to most people.
Right. Yeah. Because there's a lot of posters and stuff like "turn in your communist neighbor" crap.
Right.
And so so the aim here was to kind of say, this dude is a gun nut. Like, this doesn't sound familiar at all, right? Like, this is not. This doesn't sound like it happened a couple of months ago. At another place, maybe in Utah.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, but not saying. And so it's right when you're like, hey, these things are kind of this way. The right conclusion is this doesn't make sense, and that should be a red flag for anybody who is looking at that. Be like, I don't go everywhere and just like start telling people crap about myself, and nobody's business. And it doesn't seem like, Harvey Oswald would have been, even as a kid, there's none of these stories of him being a kid being like, oh yeah, I this, that, and the other thing. I want to do this or want to do that. There's none of those stories. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Real quick, I want to show you. I found the other picture that I wanted to show you. This is the picture of the 2 different Marguerite Oswalds. So the woman on the left is absolutely, without question, verifiably Marguerite Oswald, who was the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald. She was about 5'7". She was thin. She always worked in retail. Okay. Never worked in nursing, doesn't have any background in nursing, never had any training in nursing. The woman on the right, however, was identified as far back as 1947 as having been Marguerite Oswald, who didn't have a car, didn't drive, and worked as a nurse. Whereas the other Marguerite worked at retail, had a car, right? So this becomes brutally obvious when we get to an address 101 San Saba in Benbrook, Texas. So the whole story falls apart there because both of these women lived at that house at 2 different times. And this was brought to the awareness of John Armstrong. But that's clearly not the same woman. The woman on the right is the woman who the world knows as Marguerite Oswald. That's the woman who's in all the pictures, all the interviews, at the funeral. That's the woman who showed up and was like, my son Lee is innocent, right? That's her. Every single damn photograph of Marguerite Oswald up until 1960 is the woman on the left. This is clearly not the same woman, right? But the great thing is, I believe I know who the woman on the right actually is. I believe I know her actual name. I believe I know her actual backstory, or some of it at least. And I believe that these 2 women are actually first cousins. So that I'm still exploring. I will have to. There's not much information when you get into this kind of stuff. I mean, honestly, I need to go to New Orleans and I need to pull physical records, whatever they may be, of the woman who I believe went by the name Marguerite Oswald, who I believe her real name is Amanthe Voitier, who is the first cousin of Marguerite Oswald, the real Marguerite Oswald. So just by looking at those pictures of Marguerite and Lee, it's clear. I mean, those pictures are not the same people on either one to either account, not Marguerite nor Lee. And so, yeah, that's what my whole next series of books is all about.
Like you said, it just doesn't make any sense that we gotta set this dude up because he brought back a Russian spy. I mean, even that idea sounds like a fart in the wind. You know what I mean? It's just, that doesn't make any sense. And so do we know if the real Harvey Oswald, the one we arrested, the one with the arrested pictures, was he in California? Was this the same Harvey Oswald that was in California that worked with the laundry truck, whatever?
Okay, so obviously the official story is there's only one Lee Harvey Oswald, right? So you have to kind of try to differentiate. You have to go through all the records and make your 2 different timelines and all that stuff. And so post 59, we don't see the real Lee Harvey Oswald ever again, if you ask me. It's Harvey Oswald the entire time, all through the assassination stuff. The real Lee Harvey Oswald is in the wind, probably under a different name. And John Armstrong actually did a ton of work on that. And he identified somebody who he believes was the real Lee Harvey Oswald years later.
Yeah, see, so we understand that he was in California for a period of time in the Marine Corps. Okay. All right. Okay. And then this laundry ticket.
Oh, the laundry ticket. Okay. So I think you're mixing up some stories here. So I got you straight here though. So the laundry ticket is relevant because the laundry ticket, and this is separate from James's work on that laundry. This is a different laundry. So at the Tippit shooting, they find a jacket. Inside the jacket was a tag, a laundry tag. Forever, allegedly, nobody could figure out where this tag came from. Well, Jim Garrison determined that tag came from the laundry at El Toro Marine Base, which is basically Los Angeles. Okay, this is amazing because this basically, the suspect who killed J.D. Tippit was an Oswald impersonator, someone who looked like Oswald but wasn't. Okay, I'm going to cut to the chase. It was Kerry Thornley. Okay, the guy who I've been talking about, who'd been setting Oswald up this whole time, right? And so the reason it's so important, that tag, is because that tag, the only other person in the whole damn story besides Oswald who was at El Toro is Kerry Thornley, right? And so the tag inexplicably links Kerry Thornley to the Tippit shooting. That's why that tag is so important. All right. So, and that brings us back to Kerry Thornley, the most overlooked person in the whole damn assassination. Now, Kerry Thornley didn't have anything to do with Dealey Plaza. He was not in Dealey Plaza. His job was setting up Oswald, and then he's involved but shooting J.D. Tippit, which is the cop that got killed right after Kennedy got killed. Right. So that will lead us to the Texas Theater, where once again, 2 Oswalds are arrested out of the Texas Theater, which is wild. Oswald, as we all know, goes in. I'm not going to tell the whole story of the Texas Theater, but he's in there to meet with somebody. He's in there. He meets with a pregnant woman. No one's ever identified the pregnant woman. I have a couple suspects, but still no go there. But he's obviously there to meet a handler. He probably doesn't even know that the president's been killed because he gets in there between 102 and 107, right? So he was, by my calculations, he was in Fort Worth all morning. He didn't work at the book depository. He's in Fort Worth all morning. He catches a cab driven by a guy named Travie Delano Bo Click, who drops him off at the Texas Theater. He enters between 102 and 107. This is seen by Butch Burroughs, who is one of the guys inside the theater who works there. And so Oswald isn't alleged to have gotten to the theater until 1:36 p.m. Allegedly, he leaves the Tippit shooting and he goes and stops at Hardy's shoe store. And then he walks into the Texas Theater and he's followed in by Johnny Brewer, the guy from Hardy's shoe store. And that's how that story goes. So after Oswald is pulled out of the front of the theater, okay, about 5 minutes later, we have multiple witnesses to a guy who looked just like Lee Harvey Oswald, who's arrested in the balcony of the theater, and he's taken out the back door. Butch Burroughs, who was the candy guy there, sold Oswald popcorn at 1:15 p.m. Okay, the Tippit shooting, according to the official story, happened at 1:16 p.m. So according to the official story, he couldn't have been anywhere near the Tippit shooting because he was buying popcorn, right? But no, the Tippit shooting actually occurred at 1:06. And he was actually in the theater right around that time also. So clearly it's the second person. It was Kerry Thornley. But we have the word of Butch Burroughs, who sees this guy get arrested and taken out the back. Then we have Bernard Hare, who runs Bernie's Hobby House, which is right next to the Texas Theater. He sees all the commotion out front. He's like, what's going on? He hears commotion out back. He goes out back and he sees what he believes is Lee Harvey Oswald being arrested and put in a cop car in the back alley of the Texas Theater. Okay. So we have Oswald again, 2 places at once, arrested twice out of the Texas Theater. Oswald's in custody at this point, but 5 minutes later, we have another sighting of Oswald over at Mac Pate's garage, where he's seen wearing a white t-shirt, just like he was wearing at the Tippit shooting, inside a red Ford Thunderbird, which is actually owned by a guy named Igor Vaganov, who's a low-level mob CIA kind of spook. And so to me, this series of events is pretty wild. Oswald goes in, he meets with his handler, he buys popcorn, watches the movie, gets arrested. This whole time, Kerry Thornley's out there at the Tippit shooting. He's taking care of Tippit. He runs to a house off of Jefferson, He does a whole bunch of stuff, makes his way to the Texas Theater, goes in around 1:36-ish. So now we got 2 Oswalds in the building. No, it's wild. But that's exactly what all the evidence and witness statements say. So, but this is none of this. No, you'll never hear any of this in like an official story, right? You'll never hear the government tell you any of this stuff because they can't ever admit Oswald was being impersonated. But why would Oswald be? Okay, if Oswald's being impersonated, that's an intelligence fingerprint, period, no matter what. So they can't ever admit that. But they have major problems because the story with Oswald, he's supposed to be in Mexico City on the 26th of September and there for a couple of days. But then we have the incident with Sylvia Odio at Sylvia Odio's house, which was the September 27th, the day after Oswald's supposed to be there. So 3 guys show up at Sylvia Odio's house. She says it's 2 Cubans and a guy who introduces himself as Leon Oswald. Okay. And they try to get her to write a bunch of letters to people to raise money for the Cuban cause. And then they leave. She swears it was Lee Harvey Oswald. Right. Okay. Wasn't Oswald. Okay. It was a guy named William Seymour. William Seymour was another person impersonating Oswald. There were two primary impersonators of Oswald, Kerry Thornley and William Seymour. And when you look at pictures of these guys, you're like, damn. It's not exact. The face is a little different, but the hairline, the general height, the build, and like when it gets into CIA identity transfer, you come to understand, like even in their own writings about it, that the person doesn't have to look identical. They just have to be in a position where appearance is not going to be scrutinized, right? Like if you have the 2 people, if you have the real guy and the impersonator next to each other, people can see the differences. But when they're not next to each other, people overlook most of the stuff because they're just casual observers. So they miss the detail. And that's how they got away with all the setting up of Oswald before the assassination. All those people who came out after the assassination and was like, I was with Oswald and he talked about communism. I saw Oswald and he talked about guns. I saw Oswald and he talked about the Soviet Union, right? That's how they got away with it because the person didn't have to be identical. They just had to be similar enough to when not scrutinized and seen later on television on a grainy black and white TV. They're going to be like, that's the guy I was with when it wasn't. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, nobody thinks about how we'll have the receipts in the future of all these events.
Right. But you just nailed it because not a single one of these geniuses in the 60s ever could envision something like the internet. Do you think James Angleton could have envisioned that I could ever look up his entire life story on my computer from home? Never. The concept is like, what are you talking about? They would never, ever. So they did a lot of stuff that in hindsight, they never thought they'd get caught. But because of the glory of technology, we can figure it all out. But see, I understand once upon a time, we couldn't figure the Kennedy assassination out. But I'm sorry. Once we got into the digital age and like the late 2000 teens, like once we got by 2020, you got everything you fucking need to solve this thing, period.
It's 100% true because it was, as a kid growing up in the 80s through the 90s, this didn't sit right with me, man. There was something wrong with it. It just, if it smells like fish, it usually is.
Right. So the one thing that really, when I started my research, I really didn't think I was going to figure anything out. I figured I'm like, it's been 60 years. Some genius out there would have solved everything. And then I started to figure some things out. And I'm like, did I really figure that out? There's no way. I'm like, nah, there's no way that I could be the first person to figure this thing out. Like particularly with David Ferrie. Because the whole story about David Ferrie is that David Ferrie was this guy, real creepy weirdo, involved with Civil Air Patrol and a whole bunch of weird stuff down in New Orleans. Definitely mob and CIA connected, worked for Carlos Marcello. His official story and the official story and what all Kennedy researchers still believe to this fucking day is that he was in New Orleans on the day of the assassination where he was seen in court, seen at the offices of G. Ray Gill, then seen at a party for Carlos Marcello. It's like, dude, all your damn alibi witnesses are mobsters. Okay, what are you doing here, right? And a corrupt FBI agent named Regis Kennedy. Those are all your alibi witnesses, okay? And so once I realized David Ferrie was in Dallas and we have Ed Hoffman and we have Velma and we have a couple people who saw shooters by the knoll and in the area behind the book depository. And the person who they saw, no one's ever identified. Well, dude, it's obviously David Ferrie. When you get into who David Ferrie was and when you debunk his alibi he has a whole alibi story about going to this Winterland ice skating rink and a whole bunch of stuff. I debunked that whole alibi top to bottom. And once you debunk that alibi, it's like, whoa, David Ferrie was in Dallas where he was one of the shooters. So, once I realized that there's nobody else in the whole world who has put that conclusion out publicly yet. And so I did. And it's like, once I realized that, once I realized that, yes, there is more to be discovered, that people haven't figured out anything really, I was like, that's when I had made the decision to do this full time. And I've been doing it full time ever since, because there's so much more. Like oh my God, the amount that was undiscovered compared to what we already knew the ratio is unbelievable. There's so much more. Like, I have discovered whole new realms of research to dive into. You know what I mean? Because everyone sticks with the same old story. It's the CIA killed Kennedy over Vietnam. Shut up with your propaganda, okay? No, Israel killed Kennedy because he was going to end them as a country. Period. He saw them as the disgusting, revolting country that they are today, and he was going to cut all funding, and he was going to make sure there was no Israel, and that's why they killed him. It was an existential threat to them. And when you come to understand the Israelis' relationships with the CIA, and then the CIA's relationship with the mob, and then the mob's relationship with the Israelis, the mob and the Israelis were so goddamn tight. Menachem Begin, the father of all terrorism in the world, was Mickey Cohen's personal rabbi in Los Angeles in 1949. 49. Oh my God. Like, then you come to understand David Ben-Gurion had a personal relationship with Meyer Lansky, who ran the whole mob. Right? And there you go. You got Sanborn Institute for 20 years. They stole our military surplus post-World War II, shipped it all to Israel. You have the burglaries of multiple bunkers. We had post-World War II, all of our surplus went around the country to all these different armories in every state. They had a campaign for 20 years of breaking into these armories and stealing all those weapons and shipping them to Israel, right? This is some of the most fundamental stuff in understanding the motivation behind killing Kennedy. And this was what gets overlooked by everybody. People, all the Kennedy researchers know about the Homa bunker burglary done by David Ferrie and his guys, but they don't connect it to Inter-Armco in Virginia and the fact that Inter-Armco sent everything to Israel, not the anti-Castro Cubans, right? So everyone thinks that all the stuff that was going on and all these burglaries that they were doing was to help the anti-Castro Cubans. It's the biggest red herring in all of Kennedy.
The Vietnam thing is the biggest red herring.
Oh my God, the whole Vietnam thing is retarded. Kennedy had no intention of pulling out. You don't spend $6 billion in 1963 on airplanes and helicopters if you're not going to war. Sorry. That's the equivalent of $60 billion today.
Yeah, it was prepped. He was already prepped to do the thing.
And even the CIA in the ZR rifle files, they reference Kennedy's executive order, the troop reallocation, and they even acknowledge themselves that was not a withdrawal. That was meant to put pressure on DM to allow the CIA to get involved in their war, and it didn't work. And so they killed DM, right? And so that's what that whole thing was about, right? And so real history is never the surface level. It's always what's underneath, you know?
Yep. You always look for the real, follow the money. That's what I tell people. Follow the money, dude.
You know,
because that's 100%.
I used to think it was all about the money, but I think that's shifted in the modern era. I don't think anything Israel's doing at all today has to do with money. I think it's got to do with power and land and influence, absolute power. Yeah. So that's why it's scary, because if it was just money they were after, that's one thing. But when your motivations lie beyond money, man, that's when it gets scary.
Yeah, once again, go ahead and tell people where they can find you at and the things that you're working on, because I do believe you give presentations from time to time.
Yeah, so all my work is at coryhughes.org. It's got links to all my stuff. Really, if you're interested in World War II, I do a Substack on World War II, bloodyhistory.substack.com. Otherwise, listen to my podcast and buy my books. A Warning from History is my book, my first book, and I identified all the shooters and their relationship to the larger apparatus. So that's what I recommend everyone pick up if they're interested in actually understanding the case.
Well, Cory, I really appreciate your time, and I thank you for coming on my show.
Hey, no problem. Thank you very much.
You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
The choice is always yours. Whatever society may claim, it can't control you.
They worshipped a deity called Moloch. was a deity that was an aspect of Nimrod. And what they used to do is sacrifice children. They put them through the fire. And in the Old Testament, you see prophets condemning the people for putting their children through the fire to Moloch.
The reason that dark occult societies sacrifice children is the energy associated with it.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
We've been manipulated both in the days of royalty and in the days of politics to give our power away to that system.
The terrible thing about searching for the truth is that sometimes you find it.
You take the red pill. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. You stay in Wonderland. Believe whatever you want to believe.
See, the more at peace you become, the less you tolerate chaos. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you.
The power that politicians have is the power we give to them every day.
It's a very strange, funny time where everybody would love to be able to be themselves, but they can't because they must fall in line with the person in front of them. You want to live that kind of life? I wish you the best. I'll be on the other side somewhere.
Protecting your peace isn't about shutting the world out. It's about keeping your inner world clear enough to hear your own soul.
The truth, nothing more.